Now, the name of the book is The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. This book is written by Michelle Alexander. I want you to think about the name of that book, all right? So Alexander is claiming that Jim Crow, which was a system of oppression, a legal system of oppression that existed here in the United States for approximately 100 years, she's saying that there is a new type of legal system of oppression here in the United States, and it relates to mass incarceration, all right, which is putting people in jail. And on its face, it's supposed to be race neutral. It's supposed to be a colorblind system. But in the book, she makes the claim that it is a racist system without being obviously in your face racist. Which means that in chapter 1, she explained a lot about this, which means that no one in the government is using the N-word or calling someone a spick or saying, I'm jailing you because of the color of your skin, right? That she's claiming that there are more covert methods that are being used for this new Jim Crow system. We will, of course, discuss this in depth throughout the remainder of this unit. All right. Now I am going to cover each specific chapter. All right. I'm just going to give you a few words about each chapter so that you can start thinking about which chapter you want to write about for your essay. All right. Chapter 1 is called The Rebirth of Caste. This has to do with the history of caste systems in the United States. Okay, chapter 2 is called The Lockdown. And this chapter, which we will discuss in depth today, all right, this chapter explains the procedure of mass incarceration. Chapter 3 is called The Color of Justice, which deals with racism in the justice system. Chapter 4 is called The Cruel Hand, which deals with the eternal oppression that ex-felons must grapple with upon their release from prison. Chapter 5 is called The New Jim Crow. And in this chapter, she gives a summary of her arguments up to this point. And very interesting chapter, she confronts counter arguments. Chapter 6 is called The Fire This Time. And this chapter deals with solutions, possible solutions for fixing what she regards as the problem of mass incarceration. Now let's go into chapter 2, The Lockdown, the procedure of mass incarceration. Now, you may want to have your book out. Although, if you're watching the video, you're going to see that there is text on the screen, and I'm going to show you some images as well. But I would also urge you, please take your book out, and you could follow along with what I am about to explain. Now, according to Michelle Alexander, in this chapter, fiction and propaganda have twisted our perspective for how the justice system works. We may, because we may have watched programs or movies or listened to the news, we may think the justice system works in a fairly fluid manner. But this chapter is called The Lockdown, right? And so I'm sure you're questioning, what is the lockdown? What does that mean, right? So here in this chapter, she explains, how does a person go from being on the street, getting arrested, going to jail, having to fight his or her case in the justice system, then being sentenced to prison, and what about the stigma that happens afterwards, right? So what is the lockdown? How did we go from a country that had only 300,000 people locked down in the year 1970 to a country that has at present time over 2.5 million people locked down? The population surge does not explain that. So in this chapter, she attempts to explain the lockdown. All right? Page 60. She begins with what many people think is the reason why most people are locked down. All right? Now, people may think that people mostly are locked down in our jail and prison systems, or had been locked down in our jail and prison systems because, you know, they're kingpins, right? They're drug dealers, they're violent, they're thieves, they're burglars, you know, they're evil people, right? And on page 60, Michelle Alexander explains that the main reason that led to the surge of people being locked down was not crack, it was not heroin, it was not the big time drug dealers, it was simply marijuana possession, right? And so I'm going to read from page 60 towards the bottom of the page right here. Okay. The second myth is that the drug war is principally concerned with dangerous drugs. Quite to the contrary. Arrests for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful than tobacco or alcohol, accounted for nearly 80% of the growth in drug arrests in the 1990s. Okay, so I'll stop reading there and let's just really reflect on this briefly, because there's a lot to get through in this lecture, and you can read the text on your own, of course, right? But, you know, this confronts what she had discussed at the beginning of the chapter, which is we have an imagination about how the legal system works, right? And why people are locked down, right? And this fact that the surge of locking people down had to do with marijuana possession, not crack, not heroin, not violence. Simple marijuana possession was the main reason that led to the surge, right? And let's be frank. Most of us think of, especially now in the year 2020, we think of marijuana as something that is not too severe, right? In fact, many states have legalized marijuana, right? And even when we think of marijuana in the media, right? In the media before the year 2020, in the year 1990s, people who were involved with marijuana were thought of as stoner dudes or couch potatoes, right? But in fact, our criminal justice system was functioning to lock up certain people who were simply possessing marijuana. That means that they were not drug dealers. They were not kingpins, all right? So that's the first point, one of the first major points she wants us to understand. Also, what happened in order to get all these people locked down? Okay, on page 62, Michelle Alexander explains that we have Fourth Amendment protections. Okay, this is under the United States Constitution. To be free from unlawfully being seized or searched. But she says that once the war on drugs began in the 1980s, the Supreme Court did not enforce the Fourth Amendment. And instead allowed police more and more to search and do warrantless searches of regular citizens, right? And a real clear-cut case of one of the Supreme Court justices disagreeing with this is Justice Stevens in the California versus Acevedo case. Okay, page 63 gives us the first case that allowed stop and what is commonly known as stop and frisk. That is a case known as the Terry versus Ohio case. And I'm going to read a bit from page 63 here. In Terry versus Ohio, the Supreme Court modified the understanding of the Fourth Amendment, but only modestly, by ruling that if and when a police officer observes unusual conduct by someone the officer reasonably believes to be dangerous and engage in criminal activity, the officer is entitled, for the protection of himself and others in the area, to conduct a limited search to discover weapons that might be used against the officer. Now note here, so that was the actual language from the case. And I want to focus on the criminal activity, and it has to be dangerous, right? But instead, by the 1980s, 1990s, this case was being used to search for drugs, right? And let's note right here, simple possession of drugs is, I think many would argue, is not reasonably ascribed to danger, right? To a police officer feeling endangered, right? Nevertheless, this was the precedent that was used to have people on the streets being searched, stopped, and frisked. Okay? Page 64 is a case called Bostick. And in that case, the Supreme Court decided that if a person consents to a search, then that person has given up their Fourth Amendment rights to be protected against unlawful searches and seizures. So let's understand what this means. That means that regular people on the streets should know, and think about how much people know and what they don't know. The Supreme Court is saying here in this case that people should know that if a police officer, two buffed out police officers, or a gang of police officers with hands on their holsters, right? Okay, or maybe even their weapons drawn. Say to someone, "Hey, can I search you? Can I search you?" Right? A regular person on the street in that situation is supposed to know that they can refuse a search. Right now, I think many people, especially if you are a person of color, especially if you are a person that has grown up in a lower economic class area, or you've been, just in an environment where you think of the police as people who kill people, right? Police. You think of people, you think of police as people that have command or authority, and have deadly authority over you. You can imagine how this consent can seem preposterous. And that is what Alexander is claiming here. Alexander is claiming that it's preposterous for a 14-year-old to think he can walk away when buffed out armed police officers tell him to stop, right? And then tell him to empty out his pockets, right? That 14-year-old or that 30-year-old could say, "Hey, no, you can't do that. I'm invoking my Fourth Amendment right here, right?" Alexander is claiming that consent is an illusion. Consent is not reality. All right. Pages 69 to 72, Michelle Alexander discusses the concept of kissing frogs. Okay. And so let's go into this image. Let's understand this image here. She is claiming that police officers, what they do is they take part in mass stops and searches in certain areas in order to find, they go and they kiss lots of frogs in order to find, I guess, the prince, right? Which would be the one bust, all right? And Michelle Alexander claims that there are many methods that police officers are allowed to use in order to do this, right? In order to kiss frogs and find the bust, right? So they go and note this. For example, they'll be very strict with traffic laws with certain people, right? And they will stop that person. They will stop that person and then use that as a reason for why to search that person, right? And the police officer, Alexander, claims might guess that certain people are on probation or parole, especially because people have been involved in people have been targeted because of mass incarceration. Michelle Alexander also claims that there are drug courier profiles. And I want to read a bit from page 71 regarding about what is a drug courier profile. And this is from Michelle Alexander. The profile can include traveling with luggage, traveling without luggage, driving an expensive car, driving a car that needs repair, driving with out-of-state license plates, driving a rental car, driving with mismatched occupants, acting too calm, acting too nervous, dressing casually, wearing expensive clothing or jewelry, being one of the first to deplane, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Even, she says, even striving to obey the law fits the profile, right? And so I want to stop here and explain a bit about this point. And so Michelle Alexander is using this evidence from actual, evidence that these drug courier profiles can actually apply to anyone. And so note here, because it is written down as a drug courier profile, right? A police officer can then use it. She says that a police officer can then say, "Oh, why did you stop this person?" And all a police officer would have to say is, "Well, they fit the courier profile." What part of the courier profile did they fit? Well, you had mismatched occupants. You had for example, I'm imagining something like you had a African American gentleman wearing urban clothing and a Latino gentleman wearing a suit. So, man, I was pretty suspicious about that right there. Bam. The police then are allowed to stop the person, and then hopefully by kissing enough frogs, they will get a bust. Alexander claims that this was the main method that was used in order to gain mass incarceration in the United States. All right, page 73. All right, here. What are the incentives that local and state law enforcement had to enforce drug laws? Michelle Alexander claims that cash grants were used in order to basically bribe law enforcement agencies to care about enforcing drug laws, right? Because she says that there was initial resistance from police agencies to engage in a war that would require a lot of police, a lot of overtime, etc., right? And this is from page 73, I'm reading right now. She says it was necessary to build a consensus among state and local law enforcement agencies that the drug war should be a top priority in their hometowns. The solution? Cash. So something like the more people you bust for drugs, the more cash the federal government will give you. Of course, local and state law enforcement agencies jumped on this cash benefit, right? And just so that we understand how this cash system works, note that in San Francisco, for example, police officers get paid very, very well. On average, a police officer can gain lots of money. With overtime, a police officer in San Francisco is going to make well above $100,000 a year. And that's starting. That's starting with overtime, right? So I think that's a good example of what Michelle Alexander is discussing regarding how cash grants can work like bribes. Page 74, she begins to discuss the militarization of police, right? And initially, SWAT teams were created for hostage situations. But as the war on drugs developed, SWAT teams were used for as a military-like force, right? On page 77, she says, and I'm going to read from page 77 right now, that something that led to the militarization of police in the United States was the 1981 action by President Ronald Reagan, who persuaded Congress to pass the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act. And let's understand what this act did. What this act did was this act allowed the military to sell their surplus, give their surplus to local and state law enforcement agencies. And the justification for why they would have needed this type of military apparatus was the war on drugs. War on drugs. You guys need to. This is a war, so let's be military-like. And if you did not know, if you looked at police in the 1960s and 1970s, police officers actually looked like, I don't know. I guess you would describe them as like service workers, right? They did not wear boots. They did not, have, jumpsuits. They did not have all of this different, all of these different kind of weapons on their bodies. So all of this, Alexander traces back to the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act. Page 78. What else is an incentive for law enforcement agencies to be part of the war on drugs? Alexander identifies that seizures allow local and state law enforcement agencies to retain up to 80% of the assets value of defendants who are accused of being involved with drugs. So she calls this section in the chapter finders keepers. Let's understand how this works. She claims that police officers have an incentive to take people's possessions, their cars, their jewelry, their cash, their homes, their boats, etc., etc. And they are allowed to do this through policies that were created to fight this so-called war on drugs. And what we have is we have police agencies that are gaining great benefits by seizing these valuables from defendants. And defendants, she claims on page 78, defendants may be able to get their possessions back, but many times they're not going to fight for their possessions. For one, in order to get, let's say, for example, that you've taken, my grandfather's gold watch, right? That is probably worth, let's say, $500 or maybe $1,000, let's say, okay? That my grandfather gave to me, right? To fight for that watch would cost a lot of money, because if I'm just your regular person, I don't know how to argue to get my watch back. I would have to go and get a lawyer to do that. And that does not make any sense, that I would hire a lawyer to get an item back that is not worth what I would pay a lawyer for, right? Something else she claims is that people don't fight for their possessions back because they are afraid that if they fight for their possessions, that the district attorney and the police will get upset and stack charges on top of their charges, so that they would then be in a worse situation, right? She calls this buying freedom. That in fact, many defendants may choose, okay, check out. If I give you this boat and these cars, maybe they won't treat me so badly. Maybe they'll give me a deal, a good deal, right? And so please read on Finders Keepers if you're interested more regarding that concept. Page 85 to 87, she states that 80% of the people arrested are indigent. That means that they are poor people. And because of very harsh laws, such as the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, many indigent defendants will not want to fight their cases. Instead, they will take deals. They will take plea bargains. And most of you, or perhaps some of you only, know that most people do not go to trial, right? On TV or in the movies, you see people go to trial and they fight for their freedom, etc. Note that I can imagine probably 95%, and I'll have a link for this, okay? But I would imagine 95% of people that are accused of crimes never go to trial. I bet it may be even higher than 95%, right? But I don't have that information in front of me right now. Most people take deals. They take plea bargains, because even if they are innocent, or even if they believe that they were wrongly accused, instead of being prosecuted and then being sentenced to let's say 10 years in prison, they will take a plea bargain. If you ask an 18-year-old, for example, hey, do you want to risk 10 years in prison, or do you want to get out of jail today? All you have to do is just accept the deal, and you get out of jail today, right? Okay. The critical point that Michelle Alexander is claiming, and I'm going to read from page 89. We're getting to the end of the chapter, okay, page 89, she says this. The real point here, however, is not that innocent people are locked up. That has been true since penitentiaries first opened in America. The critical point is that thousands of people are swept into the criminal justice system every year pursuant to the drug war without much regard for their guilt or innocence. The police are allowed by the courts to conduct fishing expeditions for drugs on streets and freeways based on nothing more than a hunch. Homes may be searched for drugs based on a tip from an unreliable confidential informant who is trading the information for money or to escape prison time. And once swept into the system, people are often denied attorneys or meaningful representation and pressured into plea bargains by the threat of unbelievably harsh sentences. Sentences for minor drug crimes that are higher than many countries impose on convicted murderers. This is the way the roundup works, and it works this way in virtually every major city in the United States. Now, these policies have led to harsh mandatory minimum sentences, such as the 3 strikes and you're out policy. You can read more about this on page 90 to the end of the chapter, right? Many judges even see the unfairness of this and are heartbroken when they have to sentence defendants that they don't even want to sentence to severe prison time, right? And this leads to a recidivism cycle, and also this whole lockdown procedure leads to a stigma on the person that was convicted. And this stigma follows that person for the rest of his or her life. All right? That is the lockdown. I hope you have enjoyed